Is it a good evening or is everybody asleep? Because I'm going to be honest, I'm halfway there. All right? Good evening. We are just coming back from a retreat. I don't know how many of you realize, but we were missing quite a few people this morning, and they were all out in the woods doing shenanigans. So we had a really great weekend. Well, felt like a week. We had a really great weekend. I think things went great. Had a lot of fun. Learned a lot, I think, and overall just like really enjoyed it. But I'm going to be honest with you. I have both organized a full retreat for the weekend, been perpetually concerned with the safety of children who weren't my own, as well as my own, and preached at least 4 times in the span of the last 2 days. I'm very tired, all right? I saw Mia walk in, and she had this look. And I said, that is my spirit animal tonight. That's how I feel, all right? But we got one more to do. We got one more to do tonight. We're going to work through the book of Exodus. Great retreat, lots of tired, but we got God's word to study, so we're going to do that tonight. We're going to turn to Exodus chapter 1 and 2 and a little bit of 4. So if you'll get your Bibles open there, and we're going to talk about this story that takes place here at the beginning of the book of Exodus. This is, of course, where the people of God, Israel, they are in Egypt, and they're there because Joseph brought them there. When God delivered them through the famine, he delivered his people through this natural disaster of a famine by bringing them to Egypt. And then he carved out for them a little spot in Egypt called Goshen, and then things went downhill from there. What we're going to pay attention to, though, in this lesson is not just the story, but notice that there are, like the title of the lesson is, there are 7 women who saved the world in the beginning of the story of Exodus. All right, there are 7 women who do things that if they did not do them, the story would have happened differently. Now, similar to what Mordecai tells Esther in the story of Esther, if these women in this story didn't do it this way, God would have done it another way. We have no doubt about God's power to accomplish his will. However, these women did do things this way, and as a result, God used them in this way to accomplish his will. So that's what we're going to pay attention to as we go through. These women, it could be said that if these women in the story of Exodus don't do what they do, Moses doesn't make it. If they don't make the choices they make, Moses doesn't show up. And maybe instead of naming my son Moses, I name him Mephibosheth or something because God picked another guy. You know, really, there are so many chains of events in this story that lead to Moses doing what he does and God doing what he does through Moses. So let's start. We're just going to start here in, we're not going to read a whole bunch of names because that's hard on everybody. We're going to start in chapter 1 and verse 8. Chapter 1 and verse 8 of Exodus says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us." So pause right here. Like we said, Israel was in Egypt because God delivered them from a famine by bringing them to Egypt. He did that through Joseph. We looked at that a couple weeks ago, and it's incredible. And then there was a guy who became king over Egypt, and he forgot about Joseph. And he just said, what are all these foreigners doing here? There's too many of them, and they're pretty tough. And notice he says there's fear that they will overtake them. We'll read that in just a couple of verses. All right, so verse 10, Pharaoh says, "Come, let's deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they'll join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves." So the solution to this people group who are foreigners and too many and too mighty for Pharaoh is just abuse the mess out of them, right? Beat them down until they definitely can't fight back against us. We're gonna submit them as slaves. They're not living here anymore. They're working here. We're gonna not just make them slaves. We're going to, what is the word? We're going to ruthlessly make the people of Israel work as slaves. So the mindset of Pharaoh is, I'm afraid for my kingdom. I'm afraid for my area, so I'm going to attack these other people before they can attack me. That's the idea here. So after this, it says that the more that Israel was oppressed, the more they multiplied, which was the problem in the first place. There's too many of these people. And so Pharaoh's solution actually is counterproductive, because the more Israel was oppressed, the more that they multiplied. Then in verse 15 it says, the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other who was named Puah, when you serve as a midwife to the Hebrew women and you see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live. Okay, so Pharaoh's like, listen, the slavery is not keeping the numbers down. Let's go straight to the source, right? Let's go straight to the children. And so he goes and he grabs the Hebrew midwives and he says, if you guys see a baby boy born, kill him right then and there. Don't let baby boys be born to the Hebrews, because, like I told the kids, it takes two to tango. If you take one of those out of the equation, then they're not having any more babies, right? That was Pharaoh's mindset. Also, if you kill all the baby boys, they're not going to have an army in a couple of decades, right? So that was Pharaoh's plan. More oppression. He was trying to eradicate this threat as he saw it. And he tells the midwives to take care of it. Seems like a pretty effective plan if they follow through with it. But as we see, these midwives are the first two women that save the world, all right? Shiphrah and Puah. If we had a Bible trivia quiz and I said, what were the midwives' names who didn't kill babies in Egypt? How many of us had Shiphrah and Puah on the tip of our tongue, right? I think I'd have gone Euodia and Syntyche, and I know that's wrong, all right? So listen, Shiphrah and Puah, but these two women, I mean, they effectively saved the world. Look at the result. After Pharaoh, by the way, Pharaoh, the king who could kill them, gives them this order. Their response is, in verse 17, it says, but the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and let the male children live? Okay, so their response was, no, thank you. We're not going to do that, right? That's not in our wheelhouse. We're in the business of having babies be born, not killing them when they get here, okay? And so they just straight up don't do what the ruler of their country told them to do. And then when he calls them in and says, what happened? Like, this was a pretty easy job, you know? Just take care of the problem, so to speak, you know, to put it in mafia terms. So they said, right, verse 19, the midwife said to Pharaoh, listen, because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So they just lied, right? Like they just straight up lied. They're like, you know, we would have done what you asked, Pharaoh. We would have. We were trying to, honestly. But these Hebrew women, they just have birth too fast for us. We couldn't get there in time. And I guess, you know, after the baby's born, you can't do anything. You can't kill it then or something. I don't know what their logic was there. It doesn't seem like a great excuse, but that was their excuse. And you would think, hey, you shouldn't lie, right? But what's the response in verse 20? So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Okay, so that was the right call here for the midwives, right? They made the right call. They said, I'm not going to do what my governing authorities told me to do. I'm then going to lie about it. And God said, check and check. You guys did the right thing. We'll talk about some of that in just a little bit. But at verse 22, Pharaoh commanded, this is really important. After that tactic didn't work, Pharaoh then commands all his people. You see that phrase in verse 22? Then Pharaoh commanded all his people. This is the commandment. Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Right? Pharaoh does not care about the little girls. Just wants the boys dead. Now, this is like a statewide decree, right? This is if you see a baby boy Hebrew under the age of 2, kill him. Like, just take him out. Throw him into the river. Everyone. Like, this wasn't, hey, the officers are going to be coming by checking houses. This was, if you're an Egyptian and you're going to obey the Pharaoh, anyone who sees a baby boy, toss him in the river, because we're getting rid of these people. Right? This is a different tone. This was like a communist state where, like, if you see someone breaking the rules, you tell your authorities immediately. Like, everyone's out watching out for everyone, trying to get them. This is what Pharaoh was trying to enact here, and that makes this next part of the story really, really cool. So Shiphrah and Puah chose not to kill the baby boys, and because of that choice, that was an avenue of God saving the world through them. Chapter 2 and verse 1, we've got, now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman, which you would expect. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, or some versions will say beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could hide him no longer, she took him from a basket, took for him a basket made of bulrushes and dabbed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. Okay? So here's the second woman that saved the world. It was Moses' mom. Courtney actually has a shirt that said Moses' mother did not conform. Is that right? I can't remember what it was. I should have remembered. Courtney has a shirt about Moses' mom because, right, she's Moses' mom. Okay, so, but this Moses' mom is named Jochebed, or Yocheved, if you watch that one movie, right? A lot of different ways to pronounce this, but here's the deal, is Moses' mom also knew the commandment. She also knew the commandment. She also knew the decree in the state, and she lives in Egypt. She's probably supposed to follow that, and if she lives in Egypt and doesn't want to follow that, then she doesn't just have to hide her children whenever the inspector comes. She has to hide her son from everyone who is Egyptian. Right? This is a lot more of a commitment than just, well, we'll stay inside, and we'll hide him when the officer comes. This is, I can't let people know that I had this baby. I can't even let people know that he's awake or in the house, or that I'm in. Like, this was a covert operation for her to be able to keep her baby, because she was trying to keep it from not just the officials, but from every Egyptian in the nation and where she lived. And she chose to do that. And when he got too old to keep it a secret, she put him in a little boat and set him down in the river, which is a whole fascinating rabbit trail we're not going down right now. Let's keep reading. It says, where did we stop? Verse 4. And his sister, talking about Moses' sister named Bonnie, stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Just kidding. His sister was named Miriam. We'll talk about her in 1 second. Verse 5. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river while her young women walked beside the river. And she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. And when she opened it, she saw the child. And behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew children." Then his sister, and we'll pause right there. This is one of the Hebrew children. Pause. Remember the decree from Pharaoh? Who was supposed to kill Hebrew children? All Egyptians. Is Pharaoh's daughter an Egyptian? Yep. Is Pharaoh's daughter's servant an Egyptian who went down to get the baby out of the water? Yep. Which means you've got two people in this story who have a decree of their lead official, and he has said, you kill a Hebrew baby when you see it, and two women in this story say that's not right. They open up this basket and they find a baby in the river, and on the riverbank, which had to be surprising. Not as surprising as a baby on a doorstep. I don't know how that got started, but that, like, if someone dropped a baby off at your doorstep, you'd probably have the same feeling that Pharaoh's daughter had here. That's not where babies go. Right? That's out of the ordinary. So they open up the basket, they find a baby, and they say, hey, we can't kill this thing. Like, they know the decree, right? Her dad was the one that made the decree. And she says, I can't do that. And it says that they took pity on him. The servant could have also said, hey, your dad may not be mad at you, but you could tell him I didn't kill it, and then he'd be mad at me. And she could have taken care of the decree that Pharaoh made, and yet she chose not to. All right, so you have two women here. These are number 4 and 5. Number 1 and 2 are Shiphrah and Puah. Number 3 is Jochebed. And number 4 and 5 are Pharaoh's daughter and Pharaoh's daughter's servant, who, in this instance, if they had done the right thing according to the country they lived in, would have killed Moses. And Moses wouldn't have been here. And the book of Exodus would have been much shorter. Or had a guy with a different name, right? Those are our two options. So you've got 5 women so far in just these first couple chapters that saved the world, right? That have saved Moses, who is the man God used to deliver all of Israel out of Egypt. And then Israel is the nation that God used to get Jesus to earth. And then Jesus literally saved the world. Do you see what I'm talking about? These women saved the world, right? So then you've got the 6th woman who saves the world in verse 7. This is Moses' sister Miriam. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. And when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water." Now, Miriam is in a very dicey situation, right? I mean, we know the decree. We know that Pharaoh's daughter wasn't going to follow the decree. But I mean, if word gets out that Pharaoh's daughter didn't kill the Hebrew baby that she had the chance to kill, and that slave girl is going to tell people about it, then that could really cause problems, like political problems. It could cause an uprising. Hey, there's no backbone in Egypt. We're just going to revolt. There's more of us than there are them, right? Like there's a lot of stuff that could have come from that very little interaction. Miriam could have just said, "You know what? It doesn't look like they're going to kill him. I'm going to step out of here." She could have not gone down to the river at all and watched over Moses while he was in the basket. She could have made a number of different choices that would have been in the interest of self-preservation. And yet she chose to be there and to engage the princess of Egypt, who definitely knows the decree. And if she hadn't done that, it's quite possible that when Pharaoh's daughter brings him back to the palace where she lived with her dad, who wanted all the babies dead, that was what would happen. In fact, you could almost say it's most likely what would happen. And so Miriam steps in and keeps Moses out of Pharaoh's house until he's old enough to be weaned. He also gets to be weaned by his mother, or nursed by his mother, which is awesome. And, fun little detail, she gets paid for it. So that's cool too, right? This story ends up working out really beautifully because these 6 women so far have chose to make the right choice and ultimately led to the saving of the world. Okay? There's one more, but we got to go all the way to chapter 4 for this woman who saves the world. One more in chapter 4 and we'll start in verse. This is a super weird story and we're not going to sit in it for very long. We're just going to make the point and get out because it's a tough one. All right, chapter 4 in verse 24. All right, after Moses has just talked to God at the burning bush, the not burning bush, and then he talks to Jethro and he says, "I'm heading back to Egypt." Jethro says, "Go for it, man." And Moses packs up his family and they get on the road. And while they're on the road, verse 24, at a lodging place on the way, the Lord met Moses and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah took a flint knife, cut off her son's foreskins, and touches Moses' feet with it, and said, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." So he let him alone, and it was then that she said, "A bridegroom of blood," because of the circumcision. Ignore it all and understand Moses' life was on the line. Again, just like in the early chapters where Moses' life as an infant was on the line, Moses' life here as a brand new servant of God was on the line. And Zipporah took action and saved his life. Once again, we have another woman who keeps Moses alive, and God uses that to get us to Jesus, who saves the entire world. So in the book of Exodus, in just the first couple of chapters, chapter 1 and 2 mostly, and then also chapter 4, you've got 7 women who saved the world. Shiphrah and Puah, the Hebrew midwives, Jochebed, Moses' mother, Pharaoh's daughter and Pharaoh's daughter's servant who drew Moses out of the water, Miriam. Oh, how many am I at? Miriam is number 6. I don't know. I have these grouped up, so I only have 5 points because some of them happen together. Anyway, Miriam is number 6, Moses' sister, who chose to step in and have Moses be able to be nursed by his mother, and Zipporah. Guys, I'm so tired. I just put up 8 fingers for number 7. All right. And Zipporah, who saved Moses' life when he was on the way back to Egypt to deliver the people as God's partner that he uses. I'm going to say it again. Moses doesn't happen if these women don't make these choices, right? Moses doesn't live if these women don't make these choices. And so these 7 women effectively have saved the world because of the choices that they made. And that's I think, cool enough. If we just read that and that was our Bible study and we're like, man, how cool. Because, culturally, you don't read ancient stories about women, right? That's not really the hero of ancient stories. And so God using people you would least expect, that's awesome. Our God can use anyone. That's a super cool lesson. But there's more here, too, that I think we can take from it. The first thing I want us to take from this story, something we can learn from these 7 women that saved the world, is the fear of the Lord. Turn back to chapter 1. Look at Shiphrah and Puah here in Exodus chapter 1. Notice in verse 17, after Pharaoh's given them the commandment, their reasoning for doing what they did. It says, but the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. Right? What does Proverbs chapter 9 say? It says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Right? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight. All right? And so these Hebrew midwives had that foundation. They had the fear of the Lord, and that led them to wisdom. Now, what was their wisdom in this situation? It's not wise to kill children. I don't think God likes that. That was the wisdom that the fear of the Lord led them to in this circumstance. And so, taking that example, I think we can see, listen, we have to begin with the fear of the Lord if we want to have wisdom that will please God. Ultimately, what these midwives did pleased God. He rewarded them by giving them children of their own because of what they did. And that all started with the fear of the Lord. Because that fear of the Lord, that healthy respect for who God is and what he wants, led them to make a choice that was the right choice. And think about this. They didn't do anything extraordinary, did they? Like, most history books wouldn't record anything about these Hebrew midwives. They'd say something like, they'd probably stop right with the same phrase that was said when in verse 12, the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. Most history books would just give you the broad strokes and say, yeah, and then Pharaoh made this decree about killing the babies, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. And then Pharaoh made this other decree about everyone should kill the babies, and the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. Most history books would tell you it didn't work. That would be the point, because that's recording history. But God's history book highlights the women who made this choice. This is a very small, seemingly insignificant choice that ended up saving the world. In that moment, did Shiphrah and Puah know that they were going to save the world because of the choices that they made? No, how could they? They didn't have any idea. All they knew was there's a right thing to do here and a wrong thing to do here. And I fear God, so I'm going to try my very best to make the right choice in this situation. And God rewarded them because they made the right choice. Ultimately, they saved the world because they made the right choice, because they tried to do what was right in God's eyes. And that is all it took to save the world for Shiphrah and Puah. And so if we can take anything from them, we can definitely understand that sometimes what we do may feel insignificant, or a choice we make to reach out to someone or to encourage someone. I think this morning's lesson was on visiting, to go visit someone. It may not feel like a whole lot. It may not feel like something extraordinary, but just making the right choice, I mean, you can save the world. You can save someone's world. You can save someone's soul. Just making the right choice. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And when we have wisdom from God to make the right choice, he can use us to save the world, even if we're not doing anything that feels spectacular. Second thing I think we can take from this, or second thing that I think is really important. This one's cool. This one's really cool. The value of life. Notice this. Each of these 7 women put a value, put a great value on human life, right? They put a great, Pharaoh makes this decree, and the Hebrew midwives are like, you can almost hear him saying, no, you shouldn't kill people. That seems intuitive, right? They didn't have the 10 Commandments yet. That's just one of those that God put in our hearts. You know what I'm saying? No, you shouldn't kill babies. They're defenseless. That's wrong. So then you get to Jochebed, and it was her kid, so you kind of understand that, and you just write it off. But, ultimately, she could have died because of this, but she valued her son's life more than her own. Then you get to Pharaoh's daughter and the servant, and when they look at the baby, they say, you can't kill a baby, that's wrong. Duh! Then you get to Miriam, and she says, hey, don't take him home with you, bring him to my mom's house. She didn't say all that exactly, but don't take him somewhere dangerous, because that baby's life matters. It has value. And then you have Zipporah, as they're heading back to Egypt, knowing Moses' life was on the line, and did what she had to do to save his life. All 7 of these women put a great emphasis on the value of a human life. So does God. Okay? So does God. Which means that these women's values lined up with the things that God values. God values human life enough to create it, right? God values human life enough to give us a world that is perfectly suited for us to live in it. And ultimately, God values human life enough to send his son so that we can have human life forever, right? So God values human life. And each of these 7 women who saved the world, they valued human life, which means their values lined up with God's values, okay? Now, here's the really cool part about this, okay? Here's the really cool part about this. The introduction to the story of Exodus is set up with a which way will he go kind of conflict. You've got Moses, as he was going to be essentially the main character of the narrative. And as the story is introduced, you see that there are 2 sides. There's the side of these women let's start. The first side you see as you read through is you see the side of Pharaoh and the Egyptians. They don't value human life at all. In fact, they think humans are so worthless that if there are too many of them and they threaten you, just beat the snot out of them until they won't threaten you anymore. And if that doesn't work, kill them. Doesn't matter, as long as I don't lose my kingdom. So you have this story set up where Pharaoh and Egypt's way of doing things doesn't value life, doesn't value human life at all. It's completely disposable. We'll use them to build cities. If they die while it happens, then great. That's less of them we have to deal with. If that's not working to cut their number in half, we'll just kill the babies, right? That's the mindset of Pharaoh in Egypt, okay? Then you have the mindset of these women in contrast to that, who do value life. It's like these little pockets in that big dark world of who cares about humans, where these women jump in and they're like, no, actually, I think we should. Killing babies is wrong. And so you have these women who are contrasted with Pharaoh. Pharaoh doesn't value human life. These women value it enough, in a lot of cases, to put their lives on the line for human life, okay? Then Moses is born, okay? He's born because of what these women did. So the women who value human life saved his life. But where does he grow up? In Egypt, in Pharaoh's house, where they do not value human life. So you've got a question here. Any good movie would blatantly make this question obvious. Which way is he going to go? Which way? He was saved by these women and brought up for a time by them. But then he was raised the rest of his life in Pharaoh's house. Is he going to end up valuing human life like God does? Or is he going, and like the women who saved his life? Or is he going to end up not valuing human life and living like the Egyptians do? And then the very first thing Moses does, the very first thing we see adult Moses do is what? Both of them, right? This is awesome. Look at chapter 2. Look at chapter 2. Verse 11. It says, one day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and he looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He had a problem with the way that the Hebrews were being treated. Describes them as burdens. He's like, listen, you don't do that to people. And here's how he handled it. Verse 12, he looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. He kills a man. Okay? So he does both. You see both sides of this man's upbringing present within him. The value of human life and, well, it was this side. The value of human life and the disregard for human life. Right? And in his first action, the very first story we're told about him, you see the conflict in Moses. Which one of these is going to rule in his life? The values of God or the values of Pharaoh? And right after this, don't you kind of understand the response here? When he went out the next day in verse 13, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together, and he said to them, to the man in the wrong, why do you strike your companion? And he answered, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? Okay, so they're like, hey, you're acting like an Egyptian, right? Like, you may not think this is right, but ultimately, you're one of Pharaoh's boys. You don't care. You're going to kill one of us. You're going to kill us too? You're not living like those people that saved your life. That's ultimately what it is. And so then he's on the run and he leaves, and ultimately we see Moses transformed and used by God to be someone who saves life, not destroys it, which is awesome. But at the beginning of the story, you see it right here, are his values. You've got the question laying before you. Are his values going to line up with God's values? Or is he going to go the route of Pharaoh in Egypt? And that, I don't know. I just think that's beautiful and exciting and amazing. So you've got this value of life that the women who saved the world had. And their values lined up with God's values. And so here's what I'm going to say. Our values should line up with God's values. We need to study his word, find out what things God loves and what things God doesn't love, and love those things and not love those other things. When you read the Bible, it's absolutely impossible to get through this book without noticing that God loves people who are hurting. We should love people who are hurting. When you read through this, it's absolutely impossible to get through the book and realize that God hates people who are hurting other people. He didn't hate the people, but he hates when people hurt other people. We shouldn't value that. We need to line our values up with God's values, just like these women who saved the world. And when we do that, man, God can make some things happen. So, third thing we can learn from the story is we need to be in a position for God to use us, okay? I've referenced this a number of times now. It comes up over and over and over again in the Bible. It's why I say it so frequently. God can do big things with little people, right? God can do great things with people who are not so great, all right? You look at, like we talked about, these women who saved the world. Like, none of them did anything just extraordinarily unbelievable, superhuman, wow. They did courageous things. They did brave things. They did things that lined up with God's values. They did things that were the right choice. But they didn't do anything unbelievable. They didn't do anything that anyone else could not do. Put it that way. They didn't do anything extraordinary, but God can do great things with our seemingly irrelevant tasks. Ephesians chapter 3, in verse 20, Paul says, now to him, talking about God, who is able to do far more abundantly than all we can ask or think, according to the power at work within us. Right? God is able to do more than we can even think about. Right? So just real quick, you may have a vision for the church here in Flower Mound. What's that vision? I don't know, is it the whole city of Flower Mound to be saved? That's a vision, but I thought of it, which means God can do more, right? So say something else. Is the whole state of Texas going to become Christians? I thought of it, which means God can do more, because he can do more than we ask or imagine. He's just looking for partners to make it happen, just like he did with Moses, just like he did all throughout the story of the Bible. God has always wanted to partner with humans to accomplish his will. What that really means, let's make it as personal as possible, is that God wants to partner with you to accomplish his will. He's given you the invitation and he wants to make it happen. All you have to do is, just like these women who saved the world, be ready when he needs to use you. How do you do that? Well, let's take a page out of these 7 women in the book of Exodus. You need to be in the right position and try your best to do the right thing. That's all these women were doing. They were just doing their best to do what was right. Begins with the fear of the Lord, leads to wisdom. Wisdom helps you make the decision that you believe is absolutely the right decision, and God can use that. And here's the incredible thing, is even if you get it wrong, he can still use that. You remember Joseph's brothers? Even when you get the decision wrong, because you tried and we're humans and we fail, God can still use what you're doing if you are in the right position, trying your best to please him. Secondly, your values got to line up with God's values. If you don't value things that God values, you're probably not going to be making the right decisions. If you don't value the things that God values, that probably means you don't quite have the fear of the Lord that leads to wisdom. And so if we are going to be ready and in a position for God to use us, like these women these 7 women in the first few chapters of Exodus, we need to be doing our very best to do what is right, which begins with the fear of the Lord. And we need to value the things that God values, which implies 2 things. Number 1, we know what God values. And number 2, we live like we value those things that God values. And so ultimately, if we can do these things, we too, like the women in the first few chapters of Exodus, can be used by God to save the world. And he did that, like we said, not only through Moses, although he did deliver a whole nation of people. He didn't just do that then, but he delivered this nation of people, and then the nation of people had babies and babies and babies and babies and babies that led to Jesus. And Jesus came. He died on the cross. He took our failures to the cross so that we could live a perfect life. That's the invitation that we talk about every Sunday night and Wednesday night and Sunday morning. And that's the same invitation we offer tonight. So if you need to hear about the gospel, or if you need the prayers of the church, or you have anything that you need, come forward while we stand and sing and we'll help you.